Hello friends, my name is JJ, and given that Prime Minister Trudeau only has a couple of weeks left in office, I thought it might be interesting to do a video on his legacy. Justin Trudeau is leaving the Canadian Prime Ministership in a moment of deep unpopularity, resigning prematurely rather than seeking the fourth term he claimed to want, but the numbers suggested he had no chance of winning. And this is a pretty dramatic fall from grace, given that he was once quite popular, and certainly a man who made Canada itself quite popular on the global stage. Trudeau has been in power since November of 2015, which makes him the 7th longest serving Canadian Prime Minister ever, and thus someone who provided a lot of Zoomer-aged Canadians with their introduction to Canadian politics. I think people on both the right and the left in this country would agree that he has led a pretty activist government that has done a lot of stuff, whether they agree with those things or not. One Canadian political commentator that I quite respect, former Ambassador Norman Spector, who worked for conservative politicians when he was a younger man and now tries to offer wise and even somewhat aloof takes in his old age, had this to say: Justin Trudeau has been the most consequential Prime Minister of my lifetime, more so than any of his predecessors, including his father. However, more decades than I have left will have to pass to know whether the massive changes he has precipitated are making Canada a better country or destroying it. And that strikes me as a pretty good summary of the range of feelings you hear people express about Justin Trudeau, and I thought today we might get into some of the reasons why. So I feel like I've discussed Justin Trudeau's biography in a number of videos at this point, so let's just do a quick summary. Justin Trudeau is the eldest son of former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is usually considered the most important Canadian Prime Minister of the second half of the 20th century, Canada's Showa age, which he ran the country for a large chunk of. The younger Trudeau didn't initially show much interest in following his father into politics, though thanks to his famous last name, he did spend much of his 20s and 30s as a sort of low-tier Canadian celebrity, active in charities and things. He got elected to Parliament in 2008 when he was 36, and became head of the Liberal Party, and thus a candidate for Prime Minister in 2013 at age 41.
The son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was the frontrunner from the beginning, and tonight his coronation is complete. Now,
this is something that is sort of forgotten today, but when Trudeau was made head of the Liberals, it was considered a pretty gimmicky move, and a reflection of just how low his party's fate had fallen during the 2000s. Under former Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin, the party lost its parliamentary majority in 2004, and then lost power altogether in 2006, and then declined to 3rd place in 2011, their worst showing in Canadian history. Getting Pierre Elliott Trudeau's politically inexperienced dilettante son to run for Prime Minister was thus seen as a fairly desperate appeal to nostalgia and celebrity, and skepticism that it would work ran pretty high. I was working as a TV news pundit at the time, and I remember how popular it was for commentators on all sides to frame the young Trudeau as a bit of a airhead, a himbo even, someone who was all charms and good looks, but also deeply unqualified and unserious. Trudeau himself even leaned into this a bit, doing publicity stunts like a charity boxing match with a conservative politician that indicated he was pretty comfortable merging the worlds of entertainment and politics. But in the 2015 general election, Trudeau proved to be an effective populist of sorts, a man able to overcome elite skepticism and deliver a simple, plain-spoken message that resonated well with a broad coalition of Canadian voters. He wasn't a great orator and wasn't overly specific when it came to policy, but he preached an earnest message of the need for Canada to re-embrace its historic values of tolerance, compassion, generosity, and good global citizenship, virtues that had been supposedly lost under a decade of stern and miserly conservative rule.
What I learned from my father is that to lead this country, you need to love this country. Love it more than you crave power.
This reflected one of Trudeau's greatest skills as a politician, an ability to elicit trust by appealing to a sense of hope. It wasn't for nothing that people likened him to Barack Obama. When he was decisively elected Prime Minister on October 19th, 2015, he used a line that became an immediate catchphrase of his and a succinct summary of what he hoped to offer as well as a standard against which his time in office would be judged.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
Trudeau would be elected twice more for a total of 9 years in office. And in reflecting on the legacy of those 9 years, I want to talk about 3 specific realms in which I believe his mark was most notably felt: social issues, the Canadian economy, and Canada's role in the world. But before we get to any of that, let us hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Brown News. Hello, friends. So this looks to be a very busy year in the world of politics. Canada is getting a new prime minister or 2. There's going to be a big national election, and I assume things are happening in other places as well. So it's never been more important to have a robust strategy to stay informed. And one way that I do that is by using Ground News. Ground News is more than just a news aggregator that consolidates and summarizes the most important headlines from over 50,000 different media outlets. It is also a public service that helps you keep track of critical information about these news providers, like their ideological biases and ownership structures. When you load up Ground News on your mobile device or desktop or browser extension or phone widget, you can easily see at a glance how different stories are being given different amounts of attention or being spun in different ways by different sorts of sources. For example, the fact that one of Trump's top diplomats recently characterized Russia as having been provoked into war with Ukraine was a story mostly reported by the center-left press, while news of a new book alleging a White House cover-up of President Biden's cognitive decline was reported mostly by conservatives. Stories like these are easy to find with Ground News' famous blind spot feature. Anyway, fans of my channel can get an amazing 40% off when they sign up for a Ground News Vantage plan. That's the equivalent of just $5 a month. So give a click to the link in the thing below or give this QR code a scan. So don't delay, give Ground News a try today. Ground News, a better way to stay informed. So looking back, Trudeau really strikes me as a leader who was shaped by his times as much as he shaped them himself. A classic example would be this idea of Trudeau being very woke, which is a stereotype that I imagine will play a large role in the way he's remembered. Trudeau seems like a very naturally and even anxiously empathetic person in the way that men of privilege can sometimes be. But he also happened to come to power during an era that some wags have dubbed the Great Awakening. This refers to the idea that American culture became sharply more politically correct sometime around the mid-2010s, lasting until like now-ish. It was a time in which a lot of people became much more hyper-vigilant against acts of racism and sexism, while activist movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter emphasized the degree in which racism and sexism remain prominent and even systemic parts of our culture. As Prime Minister, Trudeau went out of his way to signal allyship to these movements, often using his talents for the more performative side of politics to make grand gestures of empathy. He was the first Canadian Prime Minister to march in a pride parade. He initiated name changes of government buildings associated with problematic historical figures, and he issued a number of symbolic apologies and pardons for some of the oppressive acts in Canada's past. And yet, in 2019, Trudeau narrowly avoided cancellation himself when it was revealed that he had repeatedly worn blackface at parties as a younger man. It was an extraordinarily humiliating moment that his critics seized upon as a case study in how a lot of righteous social justice warriors often had skeletons of hypocrisy in their own closets. This was only compounded by the fact that Trudeau also had a number of high-profile ethics scandals throughout his tenure, which similarly fed into this idea that being a good person required more than just gestures. Now, Trudeau reserved his greatest social justice passions for redressing the plight of the Native Canadians, a tragic situation that has long been singled out as the most truly systemic form of racialized oppression in Canadian society. In some significant ways, Canada has long lagged behind places like the US and Australia in terms of forging a workable modern system of recognizing the sovereignty and self-governance rights of the country's Indigenous peoples. You could easily argue it wasn't really until the 1990s that this started to be treated as a priority of the Canadian government, and even then only in a pretty vague sense. Trudeau's government, however, very consciously made Indigenous rights a huge focus of his tenure, prioritizing two principles in particular: reconciliation, or the notion that Canada must honestly own up to its past mistreatment of the Native Canadians, and nation-to-nation relationships, or the idea that Canada's government must conduct itself in a way that recognizes and dignifies the First Nations of Canada as independent, sovereign entities with rights and powers equal to that of the Canadian state. Shortly after Trudeau was sworn in, something known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a big report. This was a commission that had been set up during the previous administration as part of a class action lawsuit with Native Canadians who had been abused in various ways by government-run Indian boarding schools. But its mandate had since spiraled into a much more ambitious project seeking to document everything wrong with Canadian Indian policy. The report made 94 very sweeping recommendations, and Prime Minister Trudeau promised to implement all of them.
It is to accept fully our responsibilities and our failings as a government and as a country.
And in seeking to do this, Trudeau's government presided over a rather dramatic evolution of Canadian culture in a way that has made the plight of the Indigenous peoples of this country front and center in the public consciousness like never before. It manifests in everything from so-called land acknowledgements at the start of virtually all government meetings and announcements.
Hi everyone, glad to be here with you in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people.
That we are on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit.
The RSMP would like to respectfully acknowledge that our gathering and work today is happening on the traditional territories of the Wimuth people.
To schools changing their curriculum to mandate all sorts of new Indigenous history and culture classes, to a new national holiday to recognize the legacy of the abusive residential schools. Trudeau, of course, wasn't directly responsible for everything that's been done in Canadian society in the name of honoring the 94 recommendations. But as head of the country, he definitely chose to invest a lot of his political capital into giving the report's recommendations a revered status in Canadian society. And the consequences of his choosing to do this have in some ways changed the day-to-day character of Canada the most. Beyond the rise of a lot of new symbolic gestures of atonement and commemoration, the nation-to-nation idea has also changed the way a lot of public policy is made in Canada. The notion that Indigenous governments must be consulted before their treaty lands, or in some cases lands they simply hold traditional claim to, can be used by outsiders, became much more enshrined in Canadian law under Trudeau, as well as enforced by a number of consequential court rulings by judges that Trudeau appointed. This has proven to be most significant in the realm of the Canadian natural resource economy, just because things like mines or pipelines are often located in very remote parts of the country, where Indian reservations or land claims are located. The optimist would say that this means that Indigenous Canadians will now be much more actively included in the development of their lands in a way that will ultimately benefit their often struggling communities. While the pessimistic take would emphasize the degree that a lot of Native governments are obstinate or obstructive or radical, meaning Trudeau has simply empowered a new regressive force to hold the Canadian economy back, which might be a good transition to talking about the Trudeau-era Canadian economy in general. There's no great way to spin this. The Trudeau years have not exactly been a golden age of Canadian prosperity, according to most traditional indicators. Under Trudeau, Canada's GDP growth per capita was the lowest of the G7 industrialized economies, and Canada's unemployment rate has consistently remained the third highest. Inflation also rocketed to its highest levels in decades during the Trudeau years, which forced the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates to 20-year highs in response. In one of the most notorious broken promises of his administration, Trudeau was not able to balance the budget through steady economic growth, and instead doubled the national debt through record levels of deficit spending. To be fair to Trudeau, a lot of this can be attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic, which broke out a few months into his second term and caused years of severe economic hardship in countries all over the world. Like most world leaders, Trudeau's government responded to the crisis with a lot of stimulus spending to compensate for job and profit losses among Canadians whose jobs or businesses had been destabilized by anti-COVID lockdowns, which in Canada were mostly imposed by the provincial governments. The degree that Trudeau, or indeed any world leader, deserves to be blamed for the ensuing state of the post-COVID economy is a pretty active debate in a bunch of countries, but it has certainly turned a lot of voters sharply against their governments. There are other realms where Trudeau's economic policies have been more clearly his own ideas, however. His efforts to combat climate change would be a big one. Trudeau was hardly some degrowth radical, but he did say quite loudly and often that he believed climate change was a serious enough threat to deserve becoming a mandatory part of Canada's economic decision-making. In other words, government should use its power to discourage economic activity that thoughtlessly increases Canada's carbon emissions, which are already some of the highest per capita in the world. In practice, this included passing laws demanding much higher standards of environmental compliance for the construction of things like pipelines and mines, and even more controversially, the creation of a punitive carbon tax to be imposed on both the cost of gasoline and all businesses that emit CO2.
It is common sense that if you put a price on something you don't want, pollution, people will pollute less.
None of this was very popular, and it almost certainly played a role in both Canada's stagnant economic growth and the rising cost of living that occurred during Trudeau's tenure. His Conservative opponents have made particular hay from this idea that a carbon tax winds up being a tax on everything, given how many consumer goods require CO2 emissions to make, or gasoline to deliver.
The only thing he's doing is making life more expensive for you.
But on the other hand, Trudeau's supporters would say that this also illustrates some of the practical difficulties in trying to appease a public who say they want to see action taken against climate change, but also don't want to make any personal sacrifices along the way. Trudeau's other big controversial initiative was immigration, the realm of government policy featuring perhaps the most contentious intersection of culture and economics. Now, when you read the Canadian newspapers these days, you will often come across editorials that attack Trudeau for breaking Canada's supposed immigration consensus. This is a term that certain big shot Canadians like to use to refer to the fact that immigration has historically been less controversial in Canada than other places, or at the very least, uncontroversial enough to not be a front of mind concern for voters. Now, this is a complicated theory, and I don't know if I totally buy it, but it would be certainly accurate to say that immigration was not treated as a controversial issue by the Canadian news media or the political parties until the latter Trudeau years, and the criticism tended to revolve around two arguments. Canada's overall immigration intake got too high, and the quality of immigrants got too low. That second point is obviously a controversial thing to say, but when we talk about immigrant quality in this way, we are speaking in a narrowly self-interested economic sense. The legend has always gone that Canada has historically had an immigration system that was very targeted towards upwardly mobile middle-class immigrants, and this has allowed Canada to develop a large and respectable population of good middle-class families from places like India, Korea, China, and the Philippines over the last 4 decades or so. The idea was that Canada had a very strict and picky immigration policy, so even if the country's overall immigrant intake was quite high, it was uncontroversial because the immigrants were all bank tellers and furniture salesmen and real estate agents and things like that. Again, the reality was much more complicated, but that was the patriotic myth. What is objectively true, however, is that under Trudeau, Canada's immigration rate increased to record highs, which was significant because we'd already reached a 50-year high under the previous Conservative government. Trudeau was a big fan of immigration as something key to Canada's identity as a diverse and inclusive country.
Our country is strong not in spite of our differences, but because of them.
But for this reason, he was also prone to framing it as something that should be guided by Canadian cultural values as much as economic interests. So in addition to overall higher numbers, the amount of immigrants we let in on visas other than green cards, or what we would call PR, also rose quite dramatically, with a big influx of refugees, foreign students, and so-called temporary foreign workers. And these were classes of immigrants that were easy to dislike from all sorts of ideological directions. Their value to the Canadian economy was much less obvious, since they were either working in some of the least dynamic sectors of our already stagnant economy, if they were working at all, as well as being prone to exploitation by some of the more avaricious sectors of that economy, like minimum wage manual labor and scam community colleges. But a larger societal tension also emerges when immigration rates get too high, and it doesn't have to involve any of the traditional anxieties about immigrants being weird or criminals or whatever, although that's obviously also been present too. Canada is already a very urban country, with population centers that can be quite dense and crowded, so there becomes an unavoidable struggle for space and resources when the population rises at a rate faster than the social infrastructure can keep up with. This includes things like hospitals and public transportation and schools, as well as Canada's most fought-over resource of them all, affordable housing. Some of the global turmoil that overlapped with Trudeau's tenure probably played a role in turning a lot of Canadians off immigration as well, with diaspora politics starting to become a much more commonly shared anxiety, especially in relation to religious tensions in India and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is probably a good segue into our final chapter, global affairs. Foreign policy proved to be a surprisingly dominant theme of the Trudeau administration in a way that is pretty unusual for Canadian politics. At the best of times, Canadian prime ministers can only really aspire to influence world events at the extreme margins and probably not be particularly noticed when they do it. Canada's diplomatic relationships, likewise, tend to be extremely stable and generally reflect the broad consensus of the Western world as opposed to uniquely Canadian priorities. All of this proved to be much less the case during the Trudeau years. The biggest part of this story is probably just Trudeau's personal fame as one of the world's most recognizable and well-known politicians. Many years from now, I suspect that Trudeau will remain one of the most iconic world leaders of this particular period of history, similar to how we might think of Margaret Thatcher as being an iconic leader of the 80s, or Indira Gandhi as being an iconic leader of the 70s. And I think much of this is just because Trudeau is a very distinctive and interesting individual. You don't often see heads of state who are as handsome and youthful in the way that he was, and as comfortable with celebrity in the way that Trudeau had learned to be after a lifetime in the spotlight. The foreign press similarly really enjoyed framing Trudeau as a kind of arch-liberal at a time when right-wing populist movements were gaining power in other countries. This allowed Canada to be presented as a sort of interesting outlier, a significant and even inspiring force of resistance to global trends. I personally think that this gives Trudeau too much credit, just because he is so fundamentally a product of Canadian domestic politics, and a man who historically displayed very little interest in political developments outside of his own country. But even so, Canada's international image undeniably benefited from the heroic Trudeau narrative, at least in the short term, and at least among foreign progressives. The second half of the story, however, is that Trudeau's management of Canadian foreign policy overlapped with a number of pretty high-profile diplomatic crises that ultimately served to isolate Canada in various ways, and make Canada's foreign relationships more idiosyncratic than they had been in a very long time. Relations with Modi's India steadily worsened during Trudeau's tenure, as India began to view Canada's large population of Sikh fundamentalist immigrants as a national security threat, which they accused Canada of ignoring. I made a whole video about this. It is a pretty wild story. Trudeau had high hopes for closer ties with China under President Xi, but relations instead deteriorated after a long hostage crisis with 2 detained Canadians and accusations of Chinese interference in Canada's last 2 elections. Relations with Donald Trump's America, meanwhile, were initially relatively good, with the NAFTA trade agreement, which is critical to Canadian prosperity, being successfully renegotiated during Trump's first term. But for what seems like primarily ideological reasons, Trump really grew to hate Trudeau by the time he came back to power earlier this year. And Trudeau is now leaving office with Trump threatening monstrous, vindictive tariffs against Canadian exports. In all three of these cases, you can make the argument that Trudeau was mostly a victim of belligerent foreign leaders, with Canada at some level destined to suffer at the hands of these governments one way or another. But it's undeniable that he routinely looked weak, and by nature of his temperament and background, he seemed distinctly ill-equipped to deal with a world increasingly run by nationalistic strongmen. So obviously, this is just a relatively brief overview of aspects of the Trudeau years that I personally find to be the most consequential and important. Other people might focus on other things, including some stuff I didn't really discuss at all, including some of his media regulation initiatives, his dealings with Quebec, his drug policies, the debates surrounding vaccine mandates, and the degree he did or didn't improve the quality of Canadian democracy. In any case, when I personally reflect back on the Trudeau years, I think of a mostly stagnant time for Canada. A time defined not just by a weak economy and the trauma of COVID, but also growing political polarization and increasing cultural pessimism. While Trudeau did enjoy some early popularity, it's important to realize that he was never elected by very large margins and actually wound up getting re-elected by the smallest margin of any prime minister in Canadian history. On some level, Trudeau never really accepted this, and he often spoke in this very self-satisfied, sanctimonious way that seemed oblivious to the degree he was out of touch with much of the country. The infamous anti-Trudeau truckers' protest that occupied the Canadian capital in 2022 and had to be forcibly dispersed with emergency powers was definitely a low point of his tenure, just given what it exposed about how ugly and divisive Canadian politics had become. I am now old enough to have seen multiple Canadian prime ministers come and go, and Trudeau's departure definitely feels like a darker moment than most. Partially, this is because his resignation has been very drawn out, which I made a whole other video about. Partially, this is because of the ongoing crisis with Trump, but also partially, it's just because politics and the state of the world just feel bleaker in general. I don't think that Justin Trudeau is likely to be remembered all that positively in the long term. Despite his generally upbeat persona, I think he'll probably be seen as a mostly divisive figure, someone who contributed to the polarization of this era rather than doing much to mitigate it. But at the same time, I do think that early Justin Trudeau, Sunny Ways Justin Trudeau, will probably be seen as embodying something enviable. You know, that brief moment where Canadians felt cautiously optimistic about the potential of the post-2015 world, an era that back then still seemed exciting and uncertain. But of course, I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think Trudeau will primarily be remembered for? What role will he play in the long-term memory of Canada and indeed the world? Let me know in the comments, and next week I will have a new exciting video for you all about whoever Canada's next Prime Minister winds up being.
Hello, friends.